As his book title suggests, he is in fact a recovering environmentalist. He has held a number of journalism jobs in that vein, such as at The Independent, as a publications editor for Greenpeace, as a deputy editor for The Ecologist, as a co-founder of the Dark Mountain Project, which is more recent, and its genesis is explained a little in his essays, and as a contributor to London Review of Books, Granta, The Guardian, and more. He also has a somewhat prescient eye for subjects. He wrote a book in 2003 titled One No, Many Yeses, I believe, that investigated the anti-globalization movement, which, as some of you might have heard, is still somewhat relevant. He also, interestingly, was named an honorary member of the Lani tribe in Indonesia, I believe, or maybe just before his efforts as co-founder of the Free West Papua campaign, which, by the way, if you Google it, still very relevant. Since then, he has also turned his socially conscious pen toward fiction. Not only The Beast, but in 2014, he released a book titled The Wake, which creatively used hybrid Old English language that caught many people's eye. And once they had read a few pages, of course, they were hooked. And with that, I guess to put it succinctly, I'm a big fan, so I hope you're all as excited to hear from him as I am, because that's what's happening now. Please help me in welcoming Paul Kingsnorth.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Good. That's a good start, isn't it? Thanks all for coming out. So nice to see so many people on a Friday night. I'm impressed. Thank you. I hope it's not a disappointment. I'm at the end of a 10-day tour of the States, which is the first one I've ever done, across 3 different time zones. And I've already done about 7 events of varying kinds. So if at any point I stop making sense, I apologize. There's kind of spaghetti in my head. But it's interesting. I find every time I talk about these books, something else comes up, something new. So yes, I don't know how much to tell you about me. It's not very interesting, really. These books, it's intriguing to be publicizing 2 books at once, and particularly 2 such different books. We've got on the one hand a collection of essays, nonfiction essays that I've published over the last 7 or 8 years in various publications. Most of which come from different angles at the question of what our relationship is now with the rest of the natural world and in this time of crisis that we're living in. And then we've got this novel, which is a very different beast, literally, which is the story of one man on some kind of spiritual quest on a wild moor in the west of England. He doesn't even quite know what quest he's on. But it turns out that he gets a little more than he bargained for. And it's interesting when you put books together like this, and then they're published at the same time, and then you have to talk about them, because then people say to you, well, what are your themes as a writer? And when you're writing, you don't know what your themes as a writer are. You're just writing. You're just doing the things you want to do and the things you think are important. And it's interesting to actually have to think about that. And I've found that other people have noticed my themes clearer than I have very often. But actually, all of my books in some way come back to this strange broken link between people and the rest of nature, and what it means to live in that time, and how we can have some kind of conversation again. So yes, I was an environmental writer for a long time. I was an activist for a long time. For a long time I saw my words as a campaigning tool. I then hit a wall with that around 2008, 2009, when I looked at the realities of what was happening with climate change and started to believe that we couldn't stop it and turn it around, which I still believe. And believe that the momentum of the society that we've built is going to really hit the wall and take a lot of the natural world with it. So I thought, well, what does that mean for me? And what does that mean for any of us? What does it mean for people who are writing, trying to be creative in times like this? What kind of writing should we be producing if we really believe that this was true? Because if everything we're hearing from the climate scientists is true, then everything we've known about the world is changing in our lifetime and in our children's lifetime, possibly beyond recognition. We don't really know how that will work out. So what does it mean, and what kind of art would you create? Would you create any? What's the meaning of that? And that was the question behind the Dark Mountain project, which I started in 2009, which was originally intended to be quite a small writers group, and turned into a very big global network of many thousands of writers and artists, which still exists today. We publish several books a year, we run festivals and events and all kinds of other things, and they all delve into this question. What are the stories we're telling ourselves now? What stories should we be telling ourselves about our relationship with the rest of the world, and what kind of art, what kind of creative endeavor should we be engaging in if we were really taking this seriously? So I'll read a few extracts from different essays, and I'll read a little bit from Beast as well, and then I'll see if anyone has anything to say in response, or whether you just want to go and have a drink. And it's entirely up to you. So let me see. I'll just start with the beginning of a shortish essay in the book here. Most of these essays were published in Dark Mountain Books over the last 7 or 8 years. They were never really intended to be a collection. But as I say, when you start to put them together, you see what the theme is. And the theme is this strange broken link that at least I feel that we have between ourselves and the rest of the wild world, if you like. So this is the beginning of an essay called A Short History of Loss. In October 2006, a beekeeper from Pennsylvania dropped off 400 colonies of bees in Florida to overwinter in the much warmer state. A month later, when he returned to check on his hives, he was bewildered to find that most of the bees were missing. The queens were still there and some of the young, but all of the older bees, the honeybees who went out foraging for nectar and brought it back to feed the hive, had completely disappeared. The collapse had been rapid and almost total. Only 9 of his 400 colonies remained intact. Beekeepers regularly experience the loss of some colonies, and bees are often killed by parasites, cold winters, and other natural phenomena. But this seemed different. Over the next 6 months, nearly a quarter of all the beekeepers across the US experienced similar disappearances, losing nearly half of all their hives. Every year since then, the problem has escalated. By 2013, around half of all the honeybee hives in the US were victims of this new and mysterious plague. Soon the problem spread further, and colony collapse disorder, as the phenomena became known, was experienced across Europe too. Between 2008 and 2013, the honeybee population was reported to have dropped by 30% in Britain, 40% in Italy and Germany, and 50% in Switzerland. If the collapse continues, the bee problem could become a human problem. Many of our crops rely on bees and other insects to pollinate them. In May 2014, a report by Harvard University biologists claimed to have identified the cause of the bee collapse, a relatively new kind of pesticide known as a neonicotinoid. When colonies were deliberately treated with these pesticides, the honeybees within would abandon their hives and not return. Scientists suggested that the pesticides might be impairing the bees' memory or brain functions, making them unable to fully function or possibly remember their way home. Fortunately, over in another department of Harvard University, another team of scientists was working on a project that might render honeybees ultimately replaceable. The Robo Bees project, run by the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, is dedicated, as the name suggests, to building robotic bees. In 2009, in response to the news about colony collapse disorder, one of the team explained that they began to seriously consider what it would take to create a robotic bee colony. We wondered if mechanical bees could replicate not just an individual's behavior, but the unique behavior that emerges out of interactions among thousands of bees. So far, the Robo Bees team has succeeded in creating bee-sized robots and making them fly. The next step is to make them cooperate like a real hive. After that, the robotic insects may be trained to pollinate plants, or even to work as part of search and rescue operations in disaster zones. The Robo Bees scientists are keen to stress that they don't want their creations to replace real bees, but many of their supporters are not so shy. The Robo Bees project, explained one futurist web magazine, might seem unsettling and a violation of our aesthetic sensibilities, but we'd essentially be replacing biological robots with synthetic ones. How did we get to the point where we regard a living creature as a robot, and an inefficient one at that, ripe for replacement with better models once we've worked out how to make them? What errors have led us to this way of seeing, and were they the same errors that got us to the point where we were both willing and able to spray landscapes with toxic pesticides that wipe out vast swathes of insect life? Were they the same errors that could change the climate of an entire planet, trigger a 6th mass extinction event, acidify oceans, break up ice caps, and shred the last great forests and their inhabitants in the cause of toilet paper and soya mints? We live in what is easily the most ecologically destructive culture in human history, but how did we get here? Have humans always been hardwired for ecocide, or did things go wrong somewhere along the journey? Was there an event or a series of events in our history that led us to the point where we regarded ourselves as separate from something external called nature, which we could choose either to idealize for pleasure or ravage for profit? And if so, can we identify and learn from them? The notion that humankind has experienced a fall, a point at which we were rejected from a garden, runs like a golden thread throughout Western culture. In his novel Ishmael, Daniel Quinn suggests that the biblical story of the fall is a dim historical memory, a retelling through myth of the human development of agriculture. The Garden of Eden represents the prehistoric world of the hunter-gatherer tribes who were displaced by agriculturalists. The development of agriculture, far from being a leap forward, was in this reading a disaster. People were forced to leave a world in which wild creatures were abundant, hunting was relatively easy, and edible food was widespread, for back-breaking toil in the fields, a shorter and less healthy life, and a constant battle to subdue nature with ploughs and walls and fences and flocks. Perhaps then the development of agriculture, which is the basis for all modern civilizations, was the point at which we began to look at the non-human world as a collection of potential resources to be utilized. Certainly it was the development of agriculture and the settled communities, towns, and eventually cities that resulted, that allowed us to create the hierarchical, technologically dependent civilization that today is denuding the planet of its riches. Perhaps, on the other hand, the problem isn't agriculture but industry. Until the Industrial Revolution really got off the ground in the 18th century, the Earth's human population was small and relatively limited in the damage it could do. Then we discovered and began to extract and burn coal, gas and oil, and the party really began. It could be that the climate change that this most recent of technological leaps has already set in motion will knock the human experiment with civilization on the head altogether, but it's too early to say. Then again, perhaps the problem goes back further than this. Perhaps the taming of fire by human beings was the point at which we separated ourselves from other creatures. Perhaps it was the making of tools which allowed us to hunt and kill, way beyond the level that might be considered natural. The novelist William Golding believed that the development of language itself represented a symbolic break in human evolution. Language, he suggested, allowed us to overlay abstractions onto reality and begin to shift away from that reality into our self-created internal universe. In reality, there was probably no one moment before which we lived in harmony and after which a covenant was broken. Instead, there is a historical arc that can be traced from the development of human language to the development of synthetic bees. If there is, in the words of Thor Heyerdahl, nothing for modern man to return to, the question is what we can move on to and how we can do it in a way that brings us back in tune with what the philosopher Thomas Berry called the great conversation between humans and the rest of the natural world. So that brief bee-based introduction gets to the question that increasingly interests me, perhaps out of all the writing I've done, that it keeps circling back round to, this notion of a great conversation between humans and the rest of nature. Thomas Berry, who was a theologian as well as an ecologist, also had another lovely quote. He said, "The universe is a communion of subjects and not a collection of objects," which is rather nice. And I wonder what it means in the modern world when we believe that there is something out there called nature that's separate from us. What it means if we want to start paying attention to it again, and how it would look to us all if we believed that we were still animals in a living world rather than objects in a operating in a kind of machine society which we could control. And that's what I try to get at, I think, in most of my writing. However successfully, I don't know. But this notion that there's something broken that maybe we can attempt to look into is underlying most of it. So another little extract from another essay here. And this is a piece I wrote for the Guardian newspaper a few years ago. And it addresses the same question, particularly in terms of what writers can do. Because I was very interested in this book, particularly in the notion of what happens if you try to make the landscape or the natural world or the place you're in a character in the book. What does it look like? Because most novels, the novel is a very modern, bourgeois, Western kind of form. It's really about individual human beings having conversations with each other, and that's great. But they're against a backdrop of something, whether it's a city or whether it's the natural world, whatever it is. What happens if, as in a lot of pre-modern writing, and particularly in pre-modern poetry and some spiritual texts as well, what if that landscape and those places have something to say as well? What if they have something to do? What if they may want something from the human characters, and it may not necessarily be something benevolent either? What does it mean? How could you write like that? That's the question that really interests me at the moment. So I wrote an essay about this, and I asked how this could happen, what we could do. And I started the essay with a story of when I was in West Papua in Indonesia many years ago, and I was walking through the forest with the tribal people there, and they were taking me from one village to another. And at one point they just stopped and they looked through a break in the trees and they just sang a song to the forest in their own language. And then they walked on, and it wasn't anything they did to impress me. I didn't know what it meant until I asked them later, and they said, well, it's just a song of thanks. It's what we do. We thank the forest as we part through. It's just an exchange, because we live here as just part of the land we're in. And we sing to the forest, and the forest sings to us. And it was very matter of fact. And I thought, there's something there that I'm entirely missing in the culture that I'm in. The notion that you can speak to the forest and the forest speaks to you, and whatever that means to you. And I wondered, as writers, what would happen if we believed that was possible? What kind of work would we produce? So just a short extract from this essay, which is called Singing to the Forest. The notion that the non-human world is largely inanimate is often represented as scientific or rational, but it's really more like a modern superstition. It is just like man's vanity and impertinence, wrote Mark Twain, to call an animal dumb because it's dumb to his dull perceptions. We might say the same about a forest, and science, interestingly, might turn out to be on our side. In recent years, several studies have demonstrated that plants, for example, communicate with each other in ways that seem to point towards some degree of self-awareness. They release pheromones to warn of insect attacks, and other plants respond. They signal to each other using a series of electrical impulses, not dissimilar to that of an animal's nervous system, and they send out airborne distress signals to insect predators that feed on the plant eaters threatening them. Underground, meanwhile, are the mycelia, huge fungal networks connecting the roots of thousands of plants and trees. The more mycelia are studied, the more intriguing they appear. Once thought to be a simple means of nutrient exchange, they're now beginning to look like complex systems of inter-plant communication. Mycologist Paul Stamets, who spent his life studying them, calls mycelia a collective fungal consciousness. Ecologist Stephen Harding believes they possess an eerie intelligence and probably a peculiar sense of self. The supposedly secular West still clings to the Abrahamic notion that only humans possess consciousness or souls, and that this gives us the right or the duty to run the world. The scientists investigating animal and plant consciousness, though, may be taking us back to older ways of seeing by very modern means. Primitive savages who sing songs to the forest may not be primitive or savage after all. They may simply have retained an understanding that human-centered urban people have forgotten, that the forest is indeed alive. And not only the forest. The living world around us may turn out to be much more sentient, aware, conscious, and connected than we have allowed ourselves to believe. As a writer, I wonder what our writing would look like if we took this notion seriously. I wonder in particular what our fiction, what our stories would look like. That the world is a machine is one story, that the world is alive and aware is another. The latter story has probably been taken for granted by the majority of human societies throughout history. The former has really only taken root in ours. Post-Enlightenment industrial Western culture now becoming global culture. The results of it, climate change, mass extinction, factory farming, the usual litany of horrors, should be enough to make us wonder if this story is badly constructed, badly told, or just plain wrong. Robert Graves, in his poetic manifesto The White Goddess, wrote that modern poetry's function was to lay bare the results of humanity's break from the rest of nature. He wrote, once a warning to man that he must keep in harmony with the family of living creatures amongst which he was born, it is now a reminder that he has disregarded the warning, turned the house upside down by capricious experiments in science, philosophy, and industry, and brought ruin upon himself and his family. If this is true of poetry, it's true of fiction too. Perhaps in a century's time, any literary critics still clinging to their positions as the seas rise around them will see the work we writers produce today as a useful historical record of our society's insanity. Because we have cut ourselves off from everything that lived, and because we don't believe that it does live, we have ended up talking only to ourselves. What might the alternative look like? Perhaps the poets can see this better than the novelists. Robinson Jeffers, poet of the California Cliffs, spent his life trying to transcribe the song of the living world and make it fit for human ears. He ends his poem Carmel Point with this prescription: we must uncentre our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and ocean that we were made from. The ecological crisis we have spawned will unhumanize our views for us whether we like it or not. The notions that only humans matter or that humans are in control even of themselves are unlikely to last this century. So it seems a good time for writers to become confident as the rock and ocean and begin writing about the rock and ocean as if they had a part to play. So I'm touching towards the end there on a notion that was central to the manifesto of the Dark Mountain project that we wrote in 2009, which we called Uncivilization. Because if you're going to write a manifesto, you've got to have a grand title. You've got to get someone's attention. It's a strange thing writing a manifesto. I've never done it before. I'm not sure I'd do it again, but it's quite an interesting exercise. And it's an artistic, a literary manifesto rather than a political one. And it does ask these questions about what kind of writing we should be creating now. But at the centre of it is this notion, which I touched upon there, that all societies and all people tell stories to get them through the night and through the day. There's a quote from Ursula Le Guin. She says, there have been great civilizations that did not use the wheel, but there have been no civilizations that did not tell stories. The humans are storytelling animals, and we construct these narratives about who we are. And every culture has different stories. Every tribe will have different stories. Every civilization, every culture, every religion will have different stories about the human place in the world, who we are, where we come from, what relationship we have to the rest of the world. And so what interested me when I wrote that manifesto was, what are our stories? What stories do we believe? Because the thing about these stories is you tend not to think that they're stories. You tend to think that they're facts. And so one of these stories we tell ourselves is that we're separate from something called nature, which is out there, which we can control and manage in some way. We tell ourselves a great grand story of progress, that humanity began sort of grunting in the swamps and ends up conquering the stars, and there's a kind of linear progression there. Life is a line rather than a circle. And we tell ourselves stories that our cleverness and our technology will be able to get us out of anything that we've got ourselves into, which is a notion that the historian Ronald Wright calls the progress trap, by the way. He wrote a lovely little book called A Short History of Progress, which I recommend reading. It's very good. It unravels this whole story of progress. We touched on agriculture earlier. The notion that agriculture is a leap forward turns out not to be true when you examine the bones of agriculturalists and compare them to the bones of hunter-gatherers, who turn out to be much taller and longer lived and healthier than agriculturalists were for centuries. Humanity has only managed, incidentally, to get back to the longevity and height of pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers in the late 20th century in America. But we had to construct a kind of globe-destroying industrial system in order to do that, so that's an intriguing thought. And the point of that thought is not that we have to go back to anything, but that when we start questioning the story of linear progress, things start to look a little different. So when you start questioning your society's stories, things pop up that you didn't know were stories, and you start to think, well, what would be a better story that we could tell ourselves instead? And really the purpose of Dark Mountain, and a lot of my writing has been to try and work out what better stories we might be able to tell given the failure of these. So what I will do now, I don't know how much it relates to that, but I will read a little bit from my novel Beast, because one thing I did, I suppose, consciously try to do here was answer that question, or at least approach that question, I don't know if I can answer it, of what does it look like when you try to write as if the world were alive? As if there was something out there which is greater than you and which you don't quite understand and which might have something it wants from you, and may have some purpose in mind, or at least some relationship that you can't quite understand. As I say, I don't have an answer to that, but I do have an approach, at least in this book. So this is a fairly slim but intense book, which is set, as I said earlier, on a moor in the west of England. It's about a young man who has abandoned his wife and his child, and he's run from his life, and he's living in an abandoned farmhouse on this moor because he's looking for something. He feels he's been called away, doesn't really know what he's looking for, doesn't know what he's doing there, has some need to reconnect with something, whether it's himself or God or the land or something like that. He felt that he had to run, and he's on a search. And without wanting to tell you too much about the book, he comes across something on the moor the moor turns out to be a place that he can't get off, however much he tries to. He comes across something on the moor which he becomes obsessed with, and it turns out that his search gives him a lot more than he bargained for. Turns out maybe the moor wants something from him that he doesn't quite understand. But I'll just read a little section from the beginning of this, because it does touch on again and again this notion that what if everything else is alive? I mean, I run writing courses sometimes, and I tell the students about the mycelium. I give them a good talk about the mycelium and the living forest, and the way that the mycelial networks under an old forest can detect feet when they walk on the ground, and they can tell what the different kinds of feet are. They can tell the difference between a deer and a human and a rabbit, and the trees will send signals to each other, and they may do what they need to do with their leaves in order to put off particular predators. So in that sense, when you go for a walk in the woods, you're being watched. And I say this to my writing students, and I say, go and sit in the wood and write something that isn't just written from the point of view of somebody sitting in a pretty wood, but is written from the point of view of somebody who may be being watched by the wood. And it freaks out at least 50% of them. Because they say, well, I don't like it. But it's a novel thought. And when you go back to a lot of these indigenous cultures, it's not a novel thought at all. It's just the way they see. Well, of course the forest is watching me. Of course it is, clearly. But we've forgotten. And if you were forcibly reminded of that, what would happen to you? And the story of this man's journey, I suppose, is the story of that. So, what kind of man am I? I wonder what I think about that, now that I've spent a year here, watching the layers peel off, stripping myself back. You peel and peel and peel, but there's always another one underneath. Does the work ever end? Is there a centre, and if so, what do you find down there? Some promise, some jewel, some answer? When I came here, I thought that if I could spend enough years away from all of it, and all of them, then the thing that was in me, the colour that had descended, the song that was singing, the thing that I could still become, might emerge like a butterfly in summer, testing its dusty wings and dreaming of the sun. That was what I thought then. I wonder what I think now. I used to know everything when I was young. Now that I'm older, I don't know anything at all. Now the mystery is the thing. There are sadhus in the temples and mendicants in the mountains, all of them struggling through in search of the mystery, in search of the white light in the grey. There are fires burning on distant hills, men standing on the prows of small boats, roaring through the Java Sea, tiny people in giant canopy forests, hacking through to unseen clearings while the monkeys hoot around them. We built a world of altars because we could never put the mystery into words. We tried to make the mystery human. We tried to lock it into shape. We made sacrifices to it. We sang its poetry, and then we left the buildings empty and walked away. We don't talk about the mystery anymore, not where I come from. But nothing has changed in the world except us. Come to a place like this, though, and you can still hear it sing. I can tell you that from experience. Come to a place like this, far from the estates and the ring roads and the car parks and the black fields of beet and the screen-dumb people pacing out the slow suicide of the West around the pedestrianised precincts. Come to a place like this, shut your mouth and your mind and walk on the moor. Walk in the wind and the sun, and you will understand soon enough that this world is a great animal, alive and breathing, that we walk through it, we breathe with it, we are its breath, that when we stand on a mountain, overcome by the sunset and all that it brings, or fall to our knees in front of an altar in the presence of something greater than ourselves, then we are sensing the animal shift and turn beneath our feet. Then it is calling us home. Or perhaps it's hungry. Saint Cuthbert was called to be a hermit on the island of Lindisfarne. This was more than 1,000 years ago. There were only small wooden huts there then, and the wind and the wild sea, and everything that lived in the wild sea. Cuthbert went out there to the monastery, but the monastery was not far enough, and he was called out further. He rode to an empty island where he ate onions and the eggs of seabirds, and stood in the sea and prayed, while sea otters played around his ankles. He lived there alone for years, but then he was called back. The king of Northumbria came to him with some churchmen, and they told him he'd been elected Bishop of Lindisfarne, and they asked him to come back and serve. There's a Victorian painting of the king and the hermit. Cuthbert wears a dirty brown robe and has one calloused hand on a spade. The king is offering him a bishop's crozier. Behind him, monks kneel on the sands and pray he'll accept it. Behind them are the beached sailboats that brought them to the island. The air is filled with swallows. Cuthbert's head is turned away from the king. He looks down at the ground, and his left hand is held up, in a gesture of refusal. But he didn't refuse in the end. He didn't refuse the call. He went back. We head out because the emptiness negates us. We leave the cities and we go to the wild, high places to be dissolved and be small. We live and die at once. The topsoil is washed away and the rock is exposed, and it is not possible to play the games anymore. Now I am exposed rock. Like Cuthbert, I have been washed clean. What do I see? Well, I can't tell you what he sees, obviously, because then he wouldn't buy the book. I would spoil everything, but that's safe to say that things get a little stranger from that point. And maybe I'll just read a little section from later in the book about... So here he is. He's spent a long time on this moor. Something happens to him which means he can't get off the moor. He sees something moving on the moor which he immediately decides he has to find, this beast. He doesn't know what the hell's going on, but he knows that he has to find this thing because it will have some answer for him. And much of the rest of the book is his hunt for this object, this thing, this creature, this beast, which it turns out may be hunting him. Now this is just a short section from the book where he's decided he's going to sit by a churchyard where he first saw this creature. He's going to sit there all day and see if it comes back again. He hasn't got a better idea. He spends a lot of time in his head in this book, and the difference between what's going on outside of him and inside of him blurs at many points. So here he is, waiting for the animal. He's leaning on a yew tree. The yew must have been centuries old. It was hollow at the centre, and the wood I was leaning on had been twisted and gnarled by the ages. Its green needles were thick above me, its berries scarlet. I drank more water. I said nothing to myself or to the tree, or to anyone I could dream of or think about. I just sat and watched the lane and the hedges and the fields, and nothing happened for hours, or what I thought must have been hours. When you sit like this, you realize that nothing has its own energy, that it moves, that nothing can happen like an event or an episode. Nothingness extends itself, emptiness moves, and when you stare into it, things happen to you. At the end of the hedge, where it curled around the corner of the lane and disappeared out of my sight, was a tree. It must have been fairly young. It had a thin trunk, and its slender, angular branches hung over the lane. There were no leaves on it, so it was hard for me to tell what it was. Maybe a beech, maybe an oak. If you sit looking at anything for long enough, then everything else fades from your vision, and all you have is what you're staring at. I was staring at a small knot above the biggest branch on this tree. Its trunk was black, and it was bare in the white heat, and suddenly I saw what terrible things trees are. They sprout up from the earth. They reach out in all directions. They reach out for you. They will smother you. They will never stop growing and dividing and colonizing. They're so fecund, there's no stopping them. Chop them down, burn them, they always come back up. They stretch to the sky, these thin green fingers, they're indescribable. They're just waiting there, waiting everywhere for us to fall, and then they'll be back, and they'll grow over everything. They will suck it all in and take it up to the sky in their thin fingers. Their roots will wrap around all that we were, and our lives will rot down in the litter, and theirs will be a silent earth of roots and leaves and thin grasping, and there will be no place for us in their world at all. Then I remembered a man who would go out every morning and look at his trees. I didn't know who he was or where I remembered this from, but it felt like a memory, and it came to me as I stared across at this tree in the lane. He was an old man. He wore a tweed jacket and a flat cap, and he planted trees. Perhaps they were fruit trees. I remembered that this man, whenever I passed, he would be in his garden, walking between the trees, shuffling between them and inspecting them, looking at every leaf, turning the blossoms over, smelling them sometimes. What goes on in the head of a man who looks at trees like that? He did it for years. Perhaps he'd always done it. Perhaps he's still there doing it now. What went on in the head of someone who could do that same circuit every day, for years, forever? Why couldn't I do that? Who was he that I was not? Today, the thought of his circuit, the thought of his silent circuit of the trees filled me with horror. How much I hated trees. How much I feared things that grew. I was surrounded by trees, surrounded by things that grew, surrounded by this horrifying green abundance, and it all wanted to swallow me. And it was so silent, so slow, it spoke no language I could understand. I stopped looking at the tree. I found myself back in the churchyard leaning against the yew, but now the church seemed to loom behind me, like some presence. Now that I was aware of it, I couldn't put it beyond me. I wanted to turn to look at it to make sure it wasn't moving towards me, coming to claim me. Now the church felt like a threat. What if God was a tyrant? The Bible's God is a tyrant. He destroys worlds because people won't obey him. He flies into rages and floods everything. He burns down cities. He slaughters children. He hands down rules which must be obeyed for eternity. He sent his son to die for us, and he demands our gratitude for this, though we never asked for it. He demands that we gather in squat stone buildings and sing his praises if he's not to flood and burn us again. God, the Father of all the men who feared their fathers over the centuries, all the men who built up his church and who feared their fathers and whose sons feared them. And outside the church, where they go to worship God, is God, humming in the air. God who is the air, the unmeasurable and strange thing. This God who is not in books and did not live or die, and is not a father or a mother, and will not be obeyed and will not be denied. God who is the molecules and the air and the trees, this forcing light, this strange light roaring out. Before words, before language, before thought, before speaking, everyone must have been able to see this clear white light. Now it's all clouded. But you can make the cloud fall away, or it can fall without you. And then you can see again what is underneath the trees, the soil, the ideas, the opinions, what's always underneath them. The light has nothing for you. It makes you no promises. It's in the small things. It's in the tiny things we walk over, and past the tiny things. Past the tiny things that run the world, and we never see them because we believe we are running it ourselves, and we're walking past to lay our claim on it first. The beetles, the bacteria, the earthworms, the centipedes, the viruses, the mycelium, the seeds, lying dormant in the soil, waiting for us to burn ourselves out, for the meek shall inherit the earth. I was a stranger here, I could see it now. I was a foreigner, an invader, an immigrant, and they were turning on me. The trees, the hedges, the beetles, the things that live in the soil were turning on me, hissing at me. They wanted me out. They wanted me gone. The anger inside me had shifted, and now it felt like a great anxiety. I felt all alone in the world. This was their world, and they would take it back from me. They would take it back. Soon there would be no lane here, no church, no paths. I could see the future, and in it was nothing but trees, nothing but the things living in the trees and in the soil. A great, silent, green orchestra spread across the whole of the world. I had walked out too far. I had walked to this lonely place, and now I was surrounded, and they would eat me. I'll stop at that point. But just to say, I'll open it up and see if any of you want to say anything at this point. But just to come back again and again to this question of what ties these books and this writing together is this constant anxious search for the heart of the living world, for this notion that we have built ourselves a bubble. One of the things we talk about in the Dark Mountain Manifesto, which is in the back of the book of essays, is the notion that civilization is a bubble, that we have managed to build ourselves a probably quite temporary thing, concrete and steel and plastic edifice in which we can live, and we can have relationships only with other human beings, and we can pretend that that's what a conversation is, that it's the only one that we need. But outside it is everything else. Outside it are all the trees and the beetles and the bacteria and everything else. And we've pushed that so far now, we've pushed that relationship so far that it's breaking and all the tendrils are coming into our civilization. And so we're going to be forced somehow over the next few years or decades or centuries to start that great conversation again with the rest of the world. And so increasingly, to me, that seems like something that writers can usefully do and that we can all usefully do. And so really, I circle again and again around this question. What does that actually mean? What does it mean to have that conversation? What relationship can we have to everything else that lives in a society like this one? I don't know what the answers are, but those are the questions that really I'm exploring. So thank you for listening to all that. I do appreciate your patience. If anybody's got any questions or comments or insults that you'd like to throw at me, you're very welcome to. There are some microphones around, I believe, somewhere. Thank you. Okay.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. So I have two questions. One is, I'm wondering what you mean by a recovering environmentalist. And the second one is about your name, because it's such an unusual name and it sounds like something out of Game of Thrones. And I know there's a story behind it, so those are my questions.
You are the second person this week to tell me that my name sounds like it's out of Game of Thrones. which I have never seen, but I'm going to have to watch it now or read it. Yes, I can answer that question quickly. It's the name of a small village in Kent, in the southeast of England, which is where my family originally came from a long time ago. It's a tiny little village down there called Kingsnorth. Don't really know what the etymology of it is, actually. It may have originally meant King's Wood or something, but it's probably a very old Anglo-Saxon word, or possibly a Jutish word. But yeah, it is quite unusual. It's quite unusual even in England, which means no one can ever spell it. I regularly get called Kingsworth for some reason, which isn't a name. In answer to the first question, the title of the collection comes from an essay I wrote in 2010 for the first Dark Mountain book that we published, which is obviously in here. And it's been one of my most popular pieces of nonfiction. A lot of people have read it and reacted to it over the years. And it's an essay that explores my disillusion with environmentalism as an activist or a former activist. And it's quite long, so I couldn't summarize it very easily. But effectively, I'd got to the point, as I said earlier, where I didn't believe that we could stop climate change. I didn't believe we could prevent extinction. That didn't mean there was nothing still to do or that good work couldn't happen. But we were at such a point where the momentum of the machine couldn't be turned around. And the environmental movement I was part of had really almost become part of the problem. There was a kind of rhetoric of sustainability which had refused to question the deep stories of the society we're in that had created the problems, in my view, and instead gone with a kind of technocratic solutions mentality where the real question to be answered was, how can we stop emitting carbon by putting up as many wind farms all over the hills and as many solar panels over the deserts and as many barrages in the rivers as possible. And not only were those things being as ecologically destructive as almost anything else, but the deep questions weren't being asked. So I was feeling pretty frustrated when I wrote that essay. I've calmed down a bit now. It was a few years ago. But I felt like environmentalism just wasn't looking, that the radical heart of environmentalism, which had begun in the 60s and 70s, wasn't engaging anymore with the real question. It wasn't focusing on the reality that the industrial machine, if you like, is the cause of the problem. And fair enough, because there isn't really anything obvious you can do about that. But it turned into a kind of a quest for a sort of comfortable sustainability, which really was about sustaining our comfortable middle-class lifestyles rather than protecting what nature needed us to sustain. Those are two different things. The importance of distinguishing between protecting what the wild world and the natural world as a whole actually needs and what we would like as a culture of people living in a society like this have become confused. So I took a few years to recover from that. And as I say, since then I've been exploring what it means if you are somebody who believes that approach doesn't work anymore or is maybe wrong. But you still have a kind of passion for nature and a desire to protect it. So that's a question I circle around all the time. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Oh.
I'm a poet and writer and think about a lot of the issues that you've brought up today. And if we are in apocalypse now with climate change and so forth, what is our responsibility to have a conversation with not only other people but with nature to sustain us until we disappear?
Well, that's the question, really. That's the one I keep touching on. And it's, I think that the word apocalypse is interesting, actually, because the ancient Greek word is, I think it's apocalypsis, but it means revelation. It means unveiling. We use the word to mean collapse and disaster and zombie attack these days, but it doesn't mean that. It means a stripping away. It means a revealing of something that was hidden underneath. So in that sense, we kind of are in an apocalypse because all sorts of things are being revealed about our relationship with the rest of the earth that we've been ignoring or not noticing. And so maybe the responsibility of poets and writers is to look very hard at that and see how that could be represented. I mean, that was one of the things I felt when I wrote the manifesto, was that the first duty, actually, of probably all of us, is just to be honest about what's going on. I was at an event in Brooklyn last night and I was talking to Amitav Ghosh, who wrote a book called The Great Derangement, which is a very good book if you haven't read it. And he asks the same question in that book, and he says, look, given that everything we know about climate change and how everything is shifting so fast, and why are novelists particularly, and maybe artists more generally, just behaving as if it wasn't happening? And that's the question is not why aren't we all writing activist literature, it's just simply why are we still behaving as if we were living 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago? Why are we writing work which is still about middle-class humans talking to other middle-class humans in a world in which this giant shadow isn't hanging over us? And what would you do instead? So that, yeah, I think maybe if you're talking about responsibilities, the first one is just to really look clearly at what's going on and not pretend that it isn't happening, because we're all tempted to do that because it's quite frightening. But the first thing to do is to engage with it. And one of the things we've discovered through Dark Mountain, people often look at the Dark Mountain project from outside and say, well, this sounds enormously depressing. But it isn't, we found, which is, if it was, I wouldn't have done it for so long. It's actually liberating. And a lot of people say, being given permission to look at this honestly and talk to other people about it and not pretend that I'm optimistic, actually gives me permission to let the sort of false hope slide away. And then I can look at reality and just say, okay, there it is. Here's where we are. What do we do now? So yeah, maybe just sort of looking into the abyss is sort of the first. Looking at the apocalypse, seeing what's revealed is the first thing to do. But thank you.
Okay, I have a few comments. I think I'm really interested in what you're saying. I can relate to it. I'm interested in speciesism, and I think you were kind of touching on that. And also, last year I took off 6 months and I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail. And so I was really immersed in nature and felt that kind of connection. So I wanted to comment on that. And also, in doing that, I was raising awareness and funds to help what's going on with elephants in Africa, the poaching crisis. And the other comment that I wanted to make was when I was in Vermont on the trail, I met up with a friend, and she had studied in Scotland in the 70s at a place called Findhorn.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you're, okay.
Yeah.
And she actually told me about an experience of being able to communicate with nature and how it has really worked for her. So I just wanted to make those comments, and just if I was going to frame it in a question, I don't know what your thoughts are on, veganism and speciesism as a way of trying to counter some of the forces that we're dealing with.
Yeah, big questions, really. I think everybody has their own approach to these things, but I do think there are lots of interesting means of communication that people have worked out throughout history that we've forgotten how to hear. So, yeah, that's interesting. It's working out what those connections could look like is a big one. Yeah.
Thank you for coming to DC. I work here in the city on land conservation. This is the type of city where you can have that job, and I suspect there's probably other people in the room who work in conservation too. I really appreciate what you said about artists having to grapple with sort of the next set of stories that comes. And I apologize if I'm going to make you repeat yourself here, but I'm curious about what sort of stories you would recommend that advocates tell. Our audience on the Hill is one where you can't just say, well, we should do these things because of the virtue of there being good things to do, right? We have to find some hook, which is unfortunate. But regardless, I'm just curious about what kind of stories you would recommend we tell.
Yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it? One of the reasons, another reason I stopped doing activism and political engagement and started focusing on the kind of creative side of things that I did was that I don't know how to answer that question. Because I don't think that in a system like this, or any kind of political system which is dedicated to essentially keeping economic growth going so that the whole thing doesn't collapse, I don't think that there's another story that you can tell honestly that actually works. I'm afraid that my feeling is that until that hits the wall and falls apart, no one's going to listen to any other stories. I'm struck by the fact that we've had, this is, again, one of the big themes of the collection, we've had 40 years of environmentalism, and everything's been getting worse. We've had 25 years of climate agreements, which everybody's signed, and everything's been getting worse. All the emissions have been going up despite the agreements. Everybody talks about sustainability. Everybody talks about respecting nature, but it doesn't actually happen because the machine that operates, the operating system we're living in, is just dedicated to building and growing. And I don't know what I could offer a politician, in all honesty, other than to try and be honest about that. Somebody asked me yesterday, actually, what should politicians be doing? And I said, well, maybe just be honest about the situation. I don't have any optimism about that happening, but just look at if a politician were to stand up and criticize the notion of economic growth, and to focus on the fact that economic growth is actually the problem rather than the solution, at least in ecological terms, and to focus on the paradox that economic growth makes us richer and we like it, but at the same time it wrecks the life support systems of the earth, and we don't know what to do about that because we're stuck in that bind. That would be the beginning of a conversation. I can't see it happening. But yeah, I mean, it's one reason I just sort of pull back from that work, because I don't know how to answer it. But it's a very good question, though. It's very good. Thank you.
Hi. I just want to first thank you for coming here. I've been following the Dark Mountain Project for probably a couple of years. I think there was an article about it that ended up in Common Dreams, which is a website of progressive stuff. And I had felt as though a lot of the thoughts that I was thinking in my head were very aberrant and strange. And then
That's very common.
came to the Dark Mountain Project, and I was like, phew, you know, I would love it if there were a group exploring writing on that here locally. So I do have a question for you along those lines, but first I just wanted to share. You know, when you talk about environmentalism and other people are asking about environmentalism, it occurred to me on my way here today that I feel like we're in the bargaining phase of grief, of the stages of grief. We're still trying to bargain and continue our lifestyle and do little teeny tiny things and not really looking at where we're going. And there's a real thing that has been kind of obsessing me lately. We're right now in D.C., which is right next to a county called Montgomery County, Maryland, and it's a pretty wealthy county in the United States. And there's a huge company in Silver Spring, part of Montgomery County, called United Therapeutics, and it's a biotechnology firm. And I work in contractors around here, and went to our Chamber of Commerce dinner, and this woman who runs the company got this award. And she got up and she accepted the award, and she said, and the next thing our company is going to be doing is growing thousands of pairs of transplantable organs, you know, to solve the organ shortage crisis. And 2,000 people in the room around me are all clapping and cheering wildly. And I'm like, okay, am I the only person in the room who knows what she's talking about? And I turned to the girl at the table with me. I'm like, you know what she's talking about? The technology she's talking about is pigs. What they're doing is they're genetically modifying pigs to reduce the rejection risk, and then they're going to be farming them, and Smithfield Ham is trying to get a piece of it. They're going to be farming them, and they're going to be taking their lungs and transplanting them, and they have a long-term plan to drone these organs, to drone the pig lungs to people. So what I find so ironic about that is on my Facebook feed, something pops up profiling the company for its environmentalism, because it's a green company. And it's like this clash of things. So anyway, thank you. My soul is unrest and at dis-ease, and it helps to Misery Loves Company. And so the question is, are you bringing a workshop to the United States at any point?
Funnily enough, I did run a Dark Mountain workshop here in May, which you missed. Who knows? It's quite possible. But what I say to people when they're interested in the project is it works if people set up local groups. You know, we just started as a small group of people talking to each other about these issues. So if there's people around you who share your disgust and horror at the pigs and all the other things, it's a good opportunity to try and do that. But yeah, thank you.
Great to have you here, Paul. We were really happy to publish your essay, The Axis in the Sycamore in Orion. And one of the questions that I have, and when you're talking about apocalypse, in that essay you talk about how whether or not we want to talk about the world's religions might be what we need to be pulling from right now. But what I'm really curious of from your perspective is, as a writer and an artist, how are you looking at the stories that we've been telling and sort of going, maybe that's close, but we need to tweak it, or this is a different story than one we need to be telling? Religion offers us so many varieties in terms of the stories we can move into or look at, but more from an artistic perspective, I'm curious how your process works looking back at history.
Yeah, it's always weird when people ask me how my process works, because I don't know. I don't know what that means. You know, it's funny, and people sometimes say to you, how do you write? And you think, I don't know, I just kind of did it, and then I had to explain it to someone. No, I mean, it's just picking apart the things I see around me, and it's, you know, if you walk through life constantly dissatisfied by things, which most writers do, looking at things and going, that's wrong. And maybe that's just human, I don't know, but certainly then you have to write about it. It's a form of therapy, but it's also a form of exploration. You know, what is wrong with that? You know, you have that kind of curiosity. Well, if I don't like those pigs and all the stuff that's going on there, why? I was actually one of the things I explore a couple of times in the essay series. Like, what's the wellspring of this kind of feeling? If you do look at something like the harvesting of pig organs and just have this horrible reaction where you think this is dreadful, what's the reason for that? Where does it come from? And it's not a rational reaction, it's completely irrational, but there's nothing wrong with that, because the great majority of things that motivate us are irrational. and we pretend we're rational animals who make decisions based on facts, but we're not. We use facts to justify the decisions we were previously decided to make already at an intuitive level. There's some very interesting psychology on that, by the way, which I touch on in the book. So what's underneath? And that's the thing I'm increasingly interested in. You talk about religion. I'm interested in the notion of what we hold sacred and what we don't, and how we seem to be a society that doesn't hold anything sacred anymore, doesn't believe that anything's greater than ourselves, anything's out of bounds, and that increasingly seems to be a kind of a root of some kind of problem. But as ever, I don't have any solutions to it.
Thank you.
Okay. The thing is,
do you see any victories whatsoever? And I'll give it, or is everything relative on a curve? Like, is it going to be cleaning up a Superfund site like Love Canal? Is that the best we're ever going to do, or do you think we can do better?
Well, I mean, look, the Green Movement has had a load of victories over the last 40 or 50 years, and it continues to have them. But I tend to see them now in the grand arc of the stuff that's locked in. I mean, there's more carbon in the atmosphere now than at any time since humans have first evolved, and that's not coming down, even if we stop emitting it today. So we're committed to many degrees of climate change. We've got the fastest rate of extinction for 65 million years. That stuff's there. So we're in the middle of that. There's a huge amount of work that's been done that's been really successful as well. Great areas of land protected and chemicals banned and all sorts of stuff. So it's not an all or nothing situation. It's just that I feel that the work we do now has to be done in that context. And I also think increasingly that we have to start thinking about what, as I say, what stories are we telling ourselves that got us to that point. So that's the work. But yeah, we've won many battles, but they're still losing the war, if you like. But there's a lovely quote from Robinson Jeffers again, where he gave an address to the Library of Congress in 1941, and he said, people are always accusing me of being depressed and depressing, he said, which does happen to me too, by the way. He said, but if I write about the end of civilization, of this civilization, it's because I envisage a better one. And so, what's our task now? To try and live through this thing. Civilizations rise and fall. That happens all the way through human history. This one's probably crumbling away. What comes next? What kind of values do you have next time around? What sort of emerges from this? So that seems to be an interesting question for me now. Yeah, thanks.
Hello, my name is Oliver. I'm an engineer, and I'm no expert on philosophy, but the way I understand kind of the bounds of philosophical thought about our relationship to nature is, on one hand, you have material reductionists who think the brain is a computer, bees are computers, why not replace the bees with better computers? On the other side, you've got utilitarians who say, we're the same, species are the same, and if you're going to kill a baby or a full-grown pig, you should kill the baby because the full-grown pig is more sentient and its species is to be against the babies, put the baby higher than the pig. So in this kind of like spectrum, where do you think we are in relation to our other beings on Earth and the planet?
Good question. That demonstrates the danger of too much philosophy, doesn't it? Really,
that's why I stick to engineering.
Yeah, I think that's very sensible. Once you start, I mean, this is what happens when you pretend that we're behaving like rational beings, and we can make rational decisions. I mean, look, all life is sacred, if you ask me, but at the same time, I still have to eat some of it. So that's the paradox of being an animal, isn't it? Where are you on that spectrum? I mean, of course, you're going to value your own children more than you value the slugs in your garden. You'd be a bit psychotic if you didn't. But that doesn't mean you should poison the slugs. So it's just kind of, there's some sense that there's got to be some sense that life as a whole is a sacred thing, and that you have to have a constant negotiation with that. I come back to singing to the forest. These people have a sacred relationship with the forest. They still shoot the monkeys. They still eat from the forest. They still hunt things. It's not a garden, but there's a sense that there's some sort of relationship when you're doing that. And if you have a notion that you apologize to the pig before you kill it, or the kind of rituals that would go on in societies like that, then yeah, of course you still eat and you still take, but you don't treat the rest of the world just like it's a thing that you can abuse. So there's got to be something in that we can start to think differently about.
My question is that given that you think that climate change has reached an irreversible point, which I agree with, do you think it's irresponsible for humans to continue reproducing?
I got that question last night as well.
Sorry.
No, it's interesting. No, it's interesting to see the same questions coming up because they're the big questions. But I mean, again, I'd almost give the same answer. I mean, if we were all making rational calculations about the world, we wouldn't have these problems. And so rationally, we probably shouldn't have many children, and we should all have 2 or less. But we don't work like that, do we? I mean, I've got children, and I did think about it before I had them, and I talked about it with my wife, but I still had them because I love her, and that's just what we do. We're animals. And actually, I think pretending we're not animals is almost worse as part of the problem we've got. So, you do your best to live as well as you can in the world and as simply and responsibly as you can, knowing that you'll always make mistakes.
Well, I meant like not so much for the world, but for the children.
Oh, for the children themselves. Yeah, well, that's something else I deal with all the time as well. What do you tell the kids? How do you bring them up? And, I've got 2 children, and we try to be as honest with them as we can about how things are without depressing them. But one of the things that we do most of all is just try and give them a love of nature, actually. I see that as my responsibility. If they can spend as much time in nature as possible, they can understand it, they can feel they've got a relationship with it, then that's a kind of foundation for other stuff that goes on. But it's a good question. It's tough. Okay.
I'm going to try not to make a long speech. But I would like to add my voice to those who've just said thank you. As a fellow pessimist, I have found in a culture that sees the denial of tragedy as the highest social virtue, it's very comforting to be able to get out of that just cognitive dissonance and say, yeah, things aren't going well, and this is not going to end well. Just for a little bit of context, I have been working for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for 28 years now. I'm in the policy office. I've seen a bit, and I completely concur with your overall weariness with environmentalism, the environmental movement, and the good that we deceive ourselves that we are doing. I mean, and we do some good. One of the things I was fascinated with, to maybe take a slightly different tack here, is love paging through Beast. And I think that it and what you said about religion and religious practice and religious practices that we have lost are certainly going to be important to us as individuals as we move forward, and collectively culturally as well. It struck me that the structure and the train of thought of your character there seemed very much like what happens what's happened to me, and I know I'm not unique, in long bouts of Zen meditation. And a lot of what you are referring to and how you're looking at the world reminds me very much of my Zen master, who is, of course, one of the wisest people I've ever known. I was just wondering what degree of familiarity you have with that practice, and were you drawing on that?
Good question. Yes, is the answer. There's actually an essay in here about Buddhism, and using the tools of Buddhism to have some kind of relationship to the way that we look at things, to the state of the world, which is just really a question of coming to terms with it. So that's a good thought. It's a spiritual path that this man's on, and it's very much built on that foundation. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody. Really appreciate that.